What's keeping millions of children away from school worldwide? UNESCO says it's poverty and discrimination, and coronavirus is making things even worse. So, what should be done to secure education for all? And can that gap be bridged? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobby. Girls, immigrants, ethnic minorities and the disabled, just some of the world's children at risk of not getting any education. The United Nations says poverty and discrimination continue to prevent huge numbers from going to school. The total was around 260 million children 2 years ago, and that figure will be higher now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. 40% of low and lower middle income countries failed to support teaching during the global spread of the coronavirus. Many students were cut off from online courses during school national lockdowns. The UN's educational organization, UNESCO, is urging countries to support those left behind as life does begin to creep back towards something approaching normal. UNESCO also found half of the world's children who don't go to school, that's 97 million, live in sub-Saharan Africa. 95 million don't go to school in Central and Southern Asia. Another 17 million in the Arab world and North Africa. And 12 million in Latin America and the Caribbean. Less than 10% of countries have inclusive educational laws. And just 41 out of 195 countries worldwide officially recognize sign language. The UN says educational systems have failed to take special needs into account. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us today on Inside Story from Paris, we have Manos Antonainis, Director of Global Education Monitoring, their report from UNESCO. From Rabat, we have Lassan Haddad, International Consultant at the World Bank. And from Kuala Lumpur, we'll be joined by Man Al-Khatib, Professor at the Islamic University of Malaysia. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Lassan Haddad, this is about bridging the gap, I guess. How do we do it?
Well, I mean, it's like the report, the UNESCO report said something very important. It said that in low and middle income countries, adolescents from the richest 20% of all households were three times as likely to complete lower secondary school as were those from the poorest homes. This is very significant, and this is due to the fact that the richest kids have better access, generally, like to private schools in some situations, but also, I mean, the benefits from the capacity of their parents and also of their households to mobilize out-of-class tutoring and also to social and psychological support from parents. On the other hand, what we find is, like in most public schools attended by children coming from poor and low-income families, they suffer from teacher absenteeism, from lack of adequate teaching infrastructure and equipment. There is overcrowdedness most of the times. And there is poor stakeholder involvement in the sense that the middle class families have moved away from public schools to private schools. And so there is like a stakeholder kind of crisis with regard to these kinds of public schools. So less interaction between the teachers and the families, because I mean, for these kinds of children, for these kinds of poor children, that's why there is this kind of underperformance. There is this kind of big gap, and the gap is widening. Actually, I mean, in some countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa.
OK, we'll get onto that in more detail in just a moment. Manos Antonainis in Paris. This report identifies three overarching issues: ability, background, and identity. Which of those issues is the easiest to solve?
It is not really easy for any society to solve the problem of inclusion related to these three aspects of individuals. Every society needs to confront and be frank and honest about addressing this issue. What the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report does, that we launched today, is precisely to give a bit of more shape, a bit of more understanding into what inclusion actually means, because all countries signed up to ensure inclusive education by 2030. But for many countries, inclusion as a term tends to be associated just with disability. And the report argues that the understanding has actually grown, because the very same mechanisms that exclude children with disabilities from education, and by excluding, we mean both it keeps them out of school, but also while in school, while in classroom, they don't do as well as their peers. The same mechanisms also exclude other children who may be vulnerable because of belonging to an ethnicity, belonging to some minority. It's, of course, being poor, as very rightly was mentioned before, because we should add to this point that it's not only that the richest are 3 times more likely to complete lower secondary school. Those who do reach the end of lower secondary school, the rich are twice as likely to reach and achieve basic skills. So this is compounded over the years.
Manhatib in Kuala Lumpur, your region, I guess, was ahead of the curve when it came to being innovative with virtual classrooms and children learning online. But that's only as good as your computer infrastructure. So if you've got urban or rural areas, it's a belt and braces exercise, it's back to basics. But in that situation, what happens to children who need to be supported through education, but they're not being supported by the school?
Yes, you are right. Actually, in countries like Malaysia, for example, the country have laid down quite good internet infrastructure. And nevertheless, when the COVID-19 hit the globe, we saw that some rural areas suffered from lack of such infrastructure. For example, I myself have a student who has to travel 10-15 minutes away from his home to find a good internet service or Wi-Fi service so he can use it to join the online meetings with his colleagues. Another student in Sabah, she had to climb a tree to get stable 3G internet connection. And she had to even sleep overnight or spend overnight in the jungle to sit for her online exam. Other countries like Indonesia, which is the most populous nation in the region, we are talking about maybe 56% of the more than 250 million population have access to the internet. The remaining like 44% are suffering from lack of having accessibility to the internet. So having the device alone is not actually sufficient. To have stable and good internet connection is very crucial for providing virtual or learning on the virtual space. So I think that is kind of a challenge where the governments in general have to look into closing this gap and providing proper internet and devices services for the students to be able to cope with their colleagues no matter where they are.
Lassen Haddad in Rabat, when we talk about closing the gap here, could the situation actually be worse than we know? Because the data, the numbers of children who aren't getting any form of education, the data comes from the schools. Therefore, it's passed on to relevant education departments. It's not gathered, say, in a census situation where people from the government are knocking on doors and saying, how many children live here? Therefore, how many children are not going to school properly?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the problem of data is really, really important. And the poorer the country is, the less data reliability exists. And I think mostly it's the schools actually who do the data. What needs to be done is actually like have census. And then in relation to that census, you can compare the data that comes to schools in order to see the difference in those kinds of situations. But even the schools themselves, they are not equipped to do the data correctly. And also there is a problem with the quality of data that is gathered in so many schools. Of course, there are programs and some of them are supported by international organizations in order to improve the data quality that is gathered by schools, and also to improve the skills of the school principals and also the school administration with regard to that. But I think there is a lot of there are a lot of children who are not reported, especially those who do not show up, because we don't know, I mean, like how many of those exist and all of that. And also because there is not much statistics with regard to the sociology of an area in order to compare the degree and also the level of schooling. That's a very important question, and I think that needs also to be addressed. And there are different ways in which it can be addressed, and one of them also is to have, for example, like a social register in which all I mean, like all the citizens are registered with their children, and also that to be updated in relation to the birth certificates, and then make that, I mean, like compare that to the registration that exists within the schools. Okay. And in that way you can have really like a viable statistics with regard to the schooling, and also to who goes to school and who does not go. There are some situations where even like the dropout is not very well calculated.
Manos, I'm going to pause you there, because that's a very full answer, but there are other areas within our discussion that I would like to move towards, if I may. Manos Antoninus in Paris, lest we think this is a universally depressing aspect of being at primary school or secondary school, there are some success stories here. Some schools in Kenya, they teach in 21 languages. Now, that doesn't come down to internet access, it doesn't come down to rural infrastructure, it doesn't come down to children having to sleep in a jungle overnight because they want to go and take an exam. That's one of the examples that the report identifies. That comes down to cultural flexibility. So, why is it some schools, this one particular school in Kenya, can teach in 21 languages, but a school 10 miles down the road can't teach in so many languages?
Well, it is really a very important question, because the issue of inclusion sometimes is not just about money. Often people say inclusion costs. Actually, no, it doesn't cost if you plan in advance to be inclusive. For example, starting from a school building. If you plan in advance to make the building accessible to students with disabilities, then that will make hardly any difference to the total cost. If you try to correct all the things that were not put properly, that makes the cost very high. And if you look at the classroom, as you said, it's often just a matter of a gesture. An inclusive teacher, a teacher who is prepared to listen to every student's needs and address them properly, doesn't need to do much. Often is a matter of opening to them the way the teacher groups the children in the classroom, the way the teacher uses the language that is respectful of all children. There are so many ways that don't necessarily cost. Yes, it's true, just to bring it back to the data discussion, it will be quite costly for countries to find out exactly what is happening, and that will require perhaps the support of international organizations. But when it comes to being inclusive, it is a matter of a commitment. It's a commitment that goes at all levels. We just talked about the school, the teachers, the school leaders are of course important, how they engage with the community, how they reach out to them to make sure that their voices are also heard. And then going up to the administration, how responsive and how responsible education officials feel at the county level, at the district level, all the way up to the central level, where different government officials, because we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about multiple overlapping social problems, how the departments of education and health and social protection and the local governments that are supposed to provide these services are talking to each other.
Okay,
Often,
Man Hatib, just let me move on to Man Hatib, please, Manos Antoninus in Kuala Lumpur. Man, coming to you. How does an education authority, however, or a school, if a country is flexible enough to teach primary school children and secondary school education to teenagers, I guess, in multiple languages or different dialects, that keeps them, does it not, perhaps, tethered to staying in the country? So if you look at an Indian state like Odisha, which some people contributing to the report are basically saying that's the gold standard for teaching in India, especially at the primary school level. But if you teach them in their own language, so many Indians move around the globe for work. So they get the education, but then they maybe don't have the language skills that they need to go and do a university degree or to go and live and work abroad when they, say, hit their early or mid-20s?
Yes, language actually is quite, in this open globe where job opportunities are not limited to your country anymore. language is a very important factor in education. In Malaysia, for example, in Southeast Asia in generally, most of the countries, their medium of instruction in their schools is in their mother tongue language. And that kind of is positive in the sense that when you learn from using your mother tongue, that gives you better opportunity to understand what you are learning, and it will facilitate learning much easier to the learners. However, when it comes to looking into the global market and the availability of these students to be employed using international firms, it will be quite challenging. And in Malaysia, for example, we see this kind of situation where, because in Malaysia, schools are actually opened according to ethnicity. For example, the national schools are teaching in the national language, Bahasa Malaysia, and we have some schools which are Chinese schools are teaching in Chinese, and the Indian schools are teaching in Tamil. And among these three, we can see that English proficiency is not that major issue in Malaysia yet. It is not. I mean, referring to the workability, there might still be a need to work on improving that. In Malaysia, there has been a debate on teaching science, and especially science and mathematics subjects in English. It has been done at one time, and then the decision was reverted again back to using Bahasa Malaysia. So that kind of decision actually depends on the country itself when you're talking about looking at the identity of the nationality of the people.
Okay, Lassen Haddad in Rabat. Seems to me that this is something that has to be achieved. It's a massive jigsaw, and you have to achieve it almost on a school-by-school or maybe a region-by-region basis. But is it not that this issue is not top-down, it's bottom-up? You've got to get primary school education right rather than get secondary education right as a priority, because if the kids aren't educated properly when they're 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, you're not going to have the properly educated children to then go into the secondary school system.
That's true, and what happens is the quality of education at the primary level is really fundamental, and there are countries which have made significant progress in terms of that, in terms of generalization. So there are a lot of primary schools, I mean, all over Africa, close to the population, and that's good. The only problem is the quality of teaching, especially in some remote areas and also in some rural areas, is not really conducive to better achievement at the middle school and the higher school. And that's one of the problems. So it's the quality of the infrastructure, the quality of teaching, and also the poor conditions in which some of the teachers work, that affects tremendously the primary education that is offered to kids. But at the same time, I mean, those who have achieved a quantitative, I mean, access to all kids at the primary level then have faced the other challenge, which is that of the middle school and the secondary school. And the middle school, I mean, poses more challenges because you cannot build middle schools in every kind of place, and then because you have primary feeder schools, and then you need to have a secondary school, and that secondary school is not close by, so that creates all kinds of problems with transportation, or you have to have dorms, you have to have different kinds of mechanisms in order to make kids go there, and that raises problems especially for girls, and it has been mentioned in the report. I mean, a lot of parents are very wary about sending girls on bicycles, or for example on transport to far destinations for the secondary school, or also going to the boarding school.
Okay.
That's why there is very, very underachievement in terms of, I mean, for girls at the secondary level, whereas the gap has been closed at the primary education level. It has been a little bit, I mean, not closed at the secondary level.
Okay, Lassen, I just want to head into the last 5 or 6 minutes of the programme, roughly. Manos Antoninus in Paris. Some of your contributors on the programme today have used the word stakeholder. the report makes reference to kind of the idea of stakeholder involvement. Is that report speak, shorthand talk for governments don't really care, or some governments don't really care? Because literally, if you're talking about some of the African countries, or you're talking about some countries in the Middle East, you know, there are difficult political situations there. There are wars going on all the time. And governments have to, they would say, I guess, stay focused on making sure their borders aren't breached, as opposed to making sure that that 11-year-old gets a good education.
I think a key word is flexibility and partnership. And I think the report also says somewhere that essentially inclusion is an exercise in democracy. You have to decide what type of society you want to achieve, and education is a key lever for making that happen. So when it comes to issues of that kind, of course, there are so many political sensitivities. As I was mentioning earlier, minority issues, refugee movements, displaced people, girls, and how women are treated. And that's not only in terms of putting them in plans, it's all through, cutting across all areas of an education system, like the curriculum. The language, of course, we cover already, but the textbooks. How do you portray every group? Do you portray every group in the country on equal terms? Does someone feel their own identity? Do they feel that they're fairly described? If not, if children are feeling out, they're feeling that they're ridiculed, or that they're essentially bullied in the textbook, then they're bullied in the classroom, and then their opportunity to learn is severely compromised.
Okay, just let me put my final point, please, Manos, to Man Khatib in Kuala Lumpur. Man, we've talked about Southeast Asia, we've talked about South Asia, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, we've touched on other areas in Africa as well. Would it be fair to say, do you think, that if a country gets this right, everyone benefits, because we all have a vested interest in having a population that have got either a good basic education or something layered on top of that, like a degree level qualification? But if a country gets this wrong, everyone suffers.
Education is the best investment a country can do, because educated population will definitely contribute to the economy, to the health sector. If we look at COVID-19 crisis, we see the countries who had good education system managed to build good health facilities, and they managed to cope with the crisis very well. In Malaysia, things went very well. The crisis was managed in a very good manner, and it has been globally recognized. And definitely in Malaysia, like for example, Malaysia is investing a lot on education, trying to make education accessible to everyone, not only within the Kuala Lumpur, the city, but even further to the rural areas. There are challenges, and wherever we see challenges and we see lack of services, we see issues related to employability, related to contribution to the nation. So education is having proper education, having inclusive education where everybody is provided with that education and accessibility to schools, accessibility to universities. Definitely that will contribute very well to the country from all aspects.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there, for which I apologise. It was a compelling, but I think generally a hopeful conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks to our guests. They were Manos Antoninus, Nassan Haddad and Man Al-Khatib, and thank you too for your company. You can see the programme again anytime by going to our website, aljazeera.com, and for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story, or tweet me. I'll tweet you back. I'm @PeterDobby1. From me, Peter Dobby, and everyone on the team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.